Hey everyone, my name is Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4 demo for the piece I call Age Defiant. So this is a drawing I did in ballpoint pen, pencil as a base, and then ballpoint pen on a sketchbook a long time ago. And I've always liked it and always wanted to do something with it and never really got around to it. So I dug it up again from my phone and passed it over to my iPad and started to work with it. So this is how it'll look when everything is said and done. So let's get started on the actual process. So beginning is simple. I work in the same dimensions that I always work in, which is 8 inches by 12 inches at 300 dpi. And then I started essentially redrawing it because the original was just too messy, and if I had put it into Photoshop maybe and done some stuff in Photoshop, there's a lot more tools to try and get through how much of a mess the original sketch was. But in this case I just figured, you know what, let's redraw it, get it nice and sharp, and then it'll be easier to work with for whatever I plan on doing with it throughout the illustration, which at the time I didn't know yet. I just knew the first thing was sort of doing a restoration process on the line part of it. Now, before we get any further, I mentioned that this is an old drawing. Every time I repost this picture, people bring up Grunkle Stan, and I can totally see why. When I look at pictures of Grunkle Stan, I understand exactly what people are talking about. And then I was sitting there going, no, I had to have drawn this character before Grunkle Stan was like a thing that people knew about. So I Googled it, and I tracked down the timestamp for when this was created. I drew this on like July 24th, 2012, and Grunkle Stan's first appearance was, I think, June 15th, 2012. So Grunkle Stan beat me out the door by just over a month, but I swear I never saw that character before. But I mean, maybe I had and it somehow influenced me. But really, if I remember how I was drawing this, it was just the usual shape exploration of like, that'd be fun, I'll do that. So there was never any intention for this to be Grunkle Stan, but I completely get why people might think that that's who this is supposed to be, or think that I was influenced by that. As a funny aside, my son just recently got into Gravity Falls and has been watching it like crazy, and I haven't had a second to watch it with him, but my wife is like pretty obsessed with it, and Jack is pretty obsessed with it, and I think the younger one, my younger son, also really likes it, but I have yet to watch any of it, so I hear it's really good, but I haven't been able to check it out yet. Maybe I'll do that soon if he's still obsessed with it in the coming weeks. So you can see at this stage of the illustration, all it is following what I had originally, but just trying to do it as cleanly as possible. There's not much to it. There are a few areas where I make a different decision than I did in the original, different choice. But not a whole lot. You can see that I'm still trying to honor some of the shadows that I've got going on. When I did this original one, you can see that there's like this sort of back and forth scribble motion across his jacket. That's something that I decided to not keep going with. But for some of the cast shadows and all of that, I still keep that fine. I keep that, I keep that in the picture is what I should say. I also jump around a lot. I was redrawing this over the course of like 3 months. I would do like a little section, and then I would sock it away, and then I would do a little section, and then I would sock it away. I have a folder on my Procreate that I reference every now and then called the on hold folder, and that's essentially I start something, but if it's got enough merit, but maybe I'm just not feeling it, I'll toss the piece into there for the time being. And that's exactly what happened on this one. It just kept getting sidelined over and over and over again. One of the main ways that you can always tell that in anything that I ever do as to how or whether or not it's being sidelined is that you'll see me jump around, because I just come into it fresh and it's like, I want to work on the hand today, and then the next day, I want to work on the belt buckle today. And so that's usually the best indication that I didn't do something all in one sitting or just in a couple of tight sittings. So of course the drawing process on this can sometimes take a while. I have it slowed down here so that everybody can see it. You could probably go through this a little bit faster because you've seen plenty of other things that I've done, and you know, like the way that I draw in general. But I want to keep it in here just in case this might be somebody's first video that they're ever stumbling upon of mine. So you can see there I'm bringing in the shadow, the cast shadow from his head. There's some shadow in his ear. There's the cast shadow from his bulbous nose. And there's the shadows there from his glasses being cast down. So I try to make sure that I'm just keeping that consistent. Something that's interesting about this piece, I think the last one I did, the last video I feel like had some like major fuck-ups in it. I can't remember if that's the one or if it was the one before that, so sorry in advance if I'm remembering the wrong one, but I mentioned in a recent video, I know I mentioned the idea of like sort of not knowing what I was doing in a certain section and screwing something up. Something like that happens in this one. We'll get there, but eventually I decide to add something to the illustration that's not in the original, and then when I get to coloring it, it completely screws everything up, and I'm just off the rails. So we'll get to that soon. Also, if you're an eagle-eyed viewer and you happen to be watching every aspect of this, you're going to notice something that I forget to put in a second, and then I have to go back in and add it later. So maybe if you keep your eyes peeled, you can see what that was. Here's an example of what I always talk about, where I use a circle tool in order to make sure I'm getting the circles right and just warping it in order to get the ellipses correct, but then going back in and hand tracing it, going back over it again so that it gets a little bit of a handmade quality and it's not too precise. Even if you're using something like a circle template, there's some degree usually of human error that's involved in that. They can give it like a little bit of character, and that's just what I want to make sure. That way it's not like all of these naturalistic lines and then you've got these like machined circles right there. That's sort of why I do that. You can also see in the way that I'm shading, I'm doing the black fills on these shadows, it's not solid. I essentially do like, it's not hatched, but it's loose, let's put it that way. It's just not packed firmly. It's deliberately scratchy, and that's to keep the lines coming through, to try and simulate the shadow aspect of it, so that way you can still see, for instance, that like belt loop is still defined even though it's coming through the part that I essentially like blacked out, but it's not black. There's space in between those lines in order for other lines to come through. Some of his posing here is deliberately stylized and a little less perfectly natural. For instance, the way his right hand is on his belt. However, there's a certain degree of that just still didn't look right to me. So you'll see when we get to doing the legs, I actually sort of scoot the pelvis and widen the leg just a little bit on the new version here in order to make that hand rest a little bit better, and also to sort of correct a little bit of his anatomy. I mean, he's a weird looking dude. He's very top heavy, and then he gets really squirrely at the bottom, and it's kind of sudden. And since he's got this big jacket on, you can't necessarily see all the ways in which his body is getting down to that point. So even though all of those things are true, there was a certain amount of that anatomy that was just whack, and I needed to adjust it. So you're going to see that when I get back down to the jeans section. So here I'm working on the spikes, but I decided to not do the exact treatment that I had on the spikes, just for reasons of when this was originally done, it was purely black and white, and there were certain things that I wanted to do with the black and white in order to communicate material, and it was a very stylized way of doing the metal reflections. But then I decided that since it was going to be in color, I wanted to keep those a little bit more open to maybe try and do something when it gets to color to communicate the same thing. So here we're putting in the hand. And while I'm doing this hand, I'm thinking to myself, this doesn't really reconcile great with those legs and the hip and putting it in and this and that. And so while I'm, just pondering it constantly while drawing in the hand part, that's when I start realizing, okay, I need to actually do something about this. So what you're going to see is here, I've already decided to adjust it, but I wanted to ink it in the spots that it's actually in, kind of. That way I could still get the right, I could stay true to the original drawing, but then you could see I cut it and I scooted it once I had those base lines put down. One thing I noticed I didn't have in the original drawing was the coin pocket, so I just threw that in real quick. A pretty standard thing I tend to do whenever I do jeans or anything that has the seaming, that like ribbed seam thing, is I always have the wrinkles lie in the non-ribbed part, and then and then the ribbed part gets, the seamed part gets, it follows the form a little bit, but it doesn't get those deep cuts to try and communicate some of the thickness of that material there. There's some things I did in the original that aren't really usually my style, but I still thought they were fun, and it's probably some of the reasons why I always liked this one. Like right there, those dashes across his jeans. So I just decided to keep those in. I thought that it was an interesting texture and just kind of fun to do. So that came back in, and I made sure it was in for this the redux. All those stitches. So we throw the shadows in, then quickly dash about, putting in some of those rivets. You can see there was a second there. If you go back, you can see that I tried to put in some of that scribbly texture back into the jacket, but it wasn't really working, and I knew once the colors came in it would be a mess, so I abandoned it very quickly. So now I'm putting in all of the buttons. When I first did this, I just sort of knew I wanted those design elements there, and he's got like a bit of a greaser, punk rocker kind of vibe, so maybe buttons would make sense, but I didn't put anything on the buttons. The way that I ended up taking the colors in this was very colorful, and it sort of made him a little bit more hipster, which is why I sort of made the title Age Defiant instead of Age Defying, like all those creams and shit that you can buy. The idea there being that, of course, he's an old man, but he's not letting go of all of his like trendy fashion past stuff. So when I did that, and he got like the yellow shirt and the turquoise scarf and the bright green glasses and the black jacket and all that, it seemed more like they should just be colors and not actually have anything on them. One person made a joke on, I think it was Grizzly Miller. Yeah, it was Grizz. He posted on Instagram something to the effect of, "Oh, is this Barf Coffee's dad?" And if you follow the other videos, that punk rocker that I drew, I named him Barf Coffee. And it's certainly similar, except Barf's got a lot more opinions. All of his badges aren't just colors. All of his pins have aggressive messages on them. This guy's older, so he's more mellow, I guess. I don't know. I don't have a very deep lore for this, I'm sorry. So now we're just wrapping up some of those folds for the arm that's resting on something. You can also see that it's pretty clear from his posture that his arm is resting on something, but what is it resting on? When I did the original sketch, I was too lazy to put anything in there, so I figured that needed to be answered in this version. So here you can see I decided to put in a jukebox. I went online and found some reference and found that there were a lot of jukeboxes that all had sort of a similar model. So I found one and just sort of started sketching it based off of that. I didn't want it to be too intrusive, so it's just barely entering frame enough so that you can see that he's leaning on it. But interestingly enough, this jukebox threatens to ruin the entire coloring process for this piece. I'll talk about that when we get there. It's probably going to go by a little too fast, but what I'll do is I'll really slow down the footage there so that I can talk about it. So there it is. I mean, that's basically the jukebox then. It's all filled in, ready to go. So just adding a little bit of shadow and a couple of more tweaks. The drop shadows from the spikes. And then the drop shadow from that hand. And then there we go. These are the final lines that I then decide to take into coloring. The coloring process for this piece was simple but stylized. Essentially, I made the lines here blue, which you can see. They're set to a multiply, which is a fairly normal thing that I do. Then I'm going in and flatting it. Again, fairly normal thing that I do. But always trying to search for just something a little fun, just to mix it up a little. And you're going to see where that comes in. By and large, my goal here was to have a fairly muted palette with a middle range across the board, not too dark, not too light. The brightest thing I wanted to just be like the shines of his glasses and the shine of from his eyes. And those shines aren't done with just like a blur. I decided to use a brush and actually recreate it using one of the messier brushes from the brush section by just sort of lightly dabbing it and creating a bit of a halo of glow without it being a like computer generated blur. So right here everything is fairly straightforward, and then here's where I go what, because I realized, if you were paying attention before, I forgot to put the pin in his belt buckle that actually makes it so that the belt loop doesn't, so the belt doesn't just slide out, and I had to throw that in there real quick. That was a major blunder. But let's stop for a second here and talk about the shadow method that I end up using here. Here's a quick demo so you can see what I'm talking about, and then we'll get into how it works in the piece. So first, let's just throw a circle down so you can see it. It'd probably be even better to show it on like some sort of a more detailed surface, but you'll see that in the actual drawing. So we've got just a circle, green circle, and then on a new layer, we're going to just set it to multiply and find a warm color, a bright, light, desaturated, warm color. So we see right there, that's what we're going to use. And then I use just a soft brush for the purposes of this demo. Select the green circle, and then on that multiply layer, start painting in a shadow as if the light was just going from top right to bottom left. Not a particularly good shadow, not a particularly bad shadow. Okay, so now we've got that first shadow. Now that's usually the way where I'll stop if I'm doing like a shadow layer method. But what I did on this piece was then I did a second shadow that shifts cooler and is also set to multiply. And then that's on a separate layer. And then that's an additive thing. So what we're doing here is trying to create the notion of when you're color picking and you go from like a high to a high mid to a mid to a low mid to a low. And that's what we're trying to create here, but it gives us the dynamics of if I shift the color of the circle, it all sort of reacts to those layers. That was the point of this, and I wanted to just sort of experiment with it. It's not something that is brand new. Plenty of artists do this type of a thing or a modified version of something like this, but it was the first time that I just really wanted to commit to it for a piece and not have it be something where I'm just altering something, but where I am actually making it the way the whole thing will be colored. And then here, just as an example, white set to soft light to give me like a softer highlight than if I were to use overlay or add or something like that. And then a quick white rim light. And you can see here with these 4 layers, you can do 2 tones of shadow and then a rim light and a highlight, and it works out pretty well. So that's essentially what I end up doing across the piece. So let's get back into it. First, it starts with that warm shadow. You can see I'm using one of the artistic brushes. I don't remember which one. That is unimportant. Just experiment with brushes and see what you like. However, I am doing the select paint, select clear method. The shirt is the lowest layer of the entire stack, and so down below in the description, if you want to see the select paint, select clear method, I actually have a video where I explain it very thoroughly. It's essentially just an organized way to have one single shadow layer where you're still able to select what you're painting and have it be bound by that selection so that it's cleaner and not messy. So now I'm just going through the select paint, select clear method where I'm moving up through all of those layers and making sure that shadows are applied everywhere. Now this shadow you saw when it first went down, it was really heavy and then it got lighter. The opacity is lowered because that's the whole point of working with this kind of a method where it's very tweakable. In fact, I even tweaked the color a little bit at some point, though I can't remember at this point what I changed it to. Again, it's similar to the brush. That's not really what's important. It's not about memorizing all of these values and adjusting things to certain values. It's about training your eye to look at your illustration and understand what it needs at any given point. So far everything is on its way. It's going okay. You can see I didn't flat the buttons yet. That's because I didn't really know what I was going to do with them yet at this point. But everything is more or less progressing. It still has a little bit of that vibe of, is this all going to come together? I'm in the middle of it. Let's see where this goes. But when we get to coloring the jukebox, this whole piece falls apart. So as you can see, because I already determined my light source based on my based on my line art, that it's basically just top down. And then as I get to the coloring part and I'm doing these shadows, which are also more or less just respecting a sort of soft top down, I realized that, well, if this jukebox is going to be lit up, that is a light source. So okay, maybe that's not too bad. Maybe I can do something where the jukebox is a light source and then maybe he's got a light source above him, and then I don't know, add a soft light coming from the bottom. I mean, I started to get like lighting identity crisis syndrome or something. That's a new thing that I just made up. That's what happened to me though. So you'll see right now it's all fine. I'm just still doing the shadow layer, and then in a second I'll add in the second shadow layer and you'll see all that go and it'll be fine. And then it gets to the jukebox and all hell breaks loose. So there are a few things here that I do. I've got this shadow layer, these shadow layers that are very dynamic in the sense that you can shift those colors underneath and everything will change. But I didn't want everything to be that way, not because it's bad and not because of anything other than just I wanted to really control the way certain colors were going to be. For instance, in a second, I'm going to put the shine in, the highlight in for his leather jacket. And I wanted it to be muted, and I wanted it to be a little bit more of a color than like a pure white, or even a gray that's super neutral. And so when I get to that shine, I paint that in just by color picking the gray or the dark gray, the black that is his jacket, and then picking the color there. So we've got these dynamic shadows, but that doesn't mean that everything in this piece has a dynamic quality to it from the lighting perspective. The coat and a couple of other key things are just straight painted through color picking as if I were rendering this like a painting. Right there, there's the shine. And so that was color picked. Just some stylized shines with a lot of zigzaggy fun stuff to give it some energy. I do a little bit of that also on the belt down there. And now this shine is dynamic, if I remember correctly. It's yeah, it is. You can see it right there switching to white. It's an add layer. And now here's just a gradient with, then this is partially why I wanted a light coming up from the bottom, is I wanted to be able to get some cool warm reflections on the metal and on like the glasses, just to give depth to the whole thing and some material, some exciting material stuff in there. And he's got this gradient because the light's coming from the top, and that'll bring the eye up towards the face, which is just some standard shit. And now here I'm like, oh right, the tattoos. I totally forgot to put the tattoos. And I always kind of hated the tattoos that were on his right forearm. So here I'm going in with like a blue set to multiply, because tattoos usually age blue or a little green depending on when you got them and the ink, etc., etc. So here I did the off on his left hand. Presumably the right hand says fuck. And the whole idea of this is that going back to this whole thing where he was like an edgy youth, and he's not let go of that. Then you can see the tattoos there. I put like a snake and a skull and some whiskey and all the usual shit. Now here I'm starting to figure out what do I want to happen with those buttons. So right now I actually really like the piece. I think it's all going well. And I'm looking at reference of jukeboxes and I'm like, okay, they're really colorful. There's like blue and yellow and green, and then it shifts into like some orange and some pink. And then I'm like, okay, wait, hold on. Some of these jukeboxes also are just a little bit more monochromatic. So let's go with more of like a green to blue to purple, something like that. Get this little stripe that's down the middle that's colorized a little bit. It's either darker or lighter. Start putting some shadow on because this thing's going to glow. So it's like, okay, let's get some shadows in the middle there and have it be like a light source from the top and bottom. And as I'm doing this, I'm actually thinking to myself, like, yeah, this will be great because this will be dynamic and fun, and there'll be a bunch of colored light sources, which is kind of cool. But if this is glowing, I got to erase the cast shadow from the hand. I mean, this at this point, it's just like, I'm starting to realize I'm really stepping in it because this thing is going to be a mess by the time I'm through. So we eventually start getting some effects turned on because I'm like, we gotta solve this. What the hell is this going to look like? So here's some bounce light that I'm painting in from the jukebox. Then we bring in some more intense underlight. So like, okay, maybe green will go with the jukebox. That's good. And then this is when things get real bad. I start thinking like, well, what's the environment he's in? Should I put him in an environment? Let's get some dark shadows in the background. Let's put some wood boards up. Let's put some casting in there. This is all fine, I guess, but this is so far from where I wanted this to be. Remember I mentioned the thing about having my values all sitting in the middle, and this thing is starting to have all these punchy highs and these like computer generated transitions and glows, and then I'm like, maybe I'll do some purpley shit behind them. I'm like, this is officially a train wreck at this point as far as I'm concerned, and at some point everything was going well and I lost it. So what I said here is, okay, fuck that. The jukebox is off. So I turned the jukebox back to this yellowy off color that I saw in some of my reference, and then I fixed some of the lighting around that. And then I just go, okay, let's do that retro thing of having like the painterly white blotches all around them. That'll start also pulling it back to a bit of like a bygone era vibe. Let's get the tattoos, instead of to be a multiply, let's get them like a brighter blue, just to start bringing some style into this. And then lastly, I actually change the lines to have some parts of them that aren't multiply but are instead just solid, so that we can get red lines. This all came together at the last second, and it was like sliding under the door and grabbing my hat just as it was slamming shut. I mean, this was the last minute save here. So just to recap, we started with this older sketch, ballpoint and pencil, and then we went to the Titan lines, and then we went to this final one. And I gotta say, regardless of whether or not anybody on the planet likes this piece, I'm just happy that I saved it, and I can be somewhat proud of it. I mean, I'm actually proud of it. I think it's a cool piece. It came out nice, but it's more about the save at this point on this one. So there's some insight into the mentality of it, and how I came up with it and how I saved it. I really hope you guys liked it, and as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.